All right, guys, I've spent the last 2 months setting up my brand new irrigation system for this year, and I'm not gonna lie, it's pretty sexy. I've got 5 different zones that I've set up that run independently. I'm utilizing a whole combination of different emitters, sprayers, and drip line. And so far, all the plants are responding to it really, really well. So in today's video, I'm gonna walk you through the entire setup, show you all the different components that I'm utilizing so that you can set up something similar for yourself. And to get started, let's head over to the faucet for the first component. So here's the faucet that comes out of the house, and coming off of it, I've got a 2-way splitter. Now coming off the left-hand side, we've obviously got my first automatic watering system or timer. And then coming out this side, on the other side of this structure, I've got another one of the exact same automatic timers with 4 different zones, which at the moment is just sitting on the ground, but maybe I'll connect it to something in the next bit. Now, what I love so much about these 4-way automatic timers is that each of them obviously allows me to set up 4 different growing zones. So by having 2 of them up and running, I can have 8 different growing zones or watering zones that I'm able to have running independently. And I'm going to share with you a little bit later on in the video why that's so important when you get to a garden of my size. But for right now, I'm actually only utilizing 5 of the zones. And so I want to share with you how I've structured my garden in terms of watering zones. Now, zone number 1 is 3 raised beds that include my tomatoes, basil, and garlic. Zone 2 is also raised beds, but now it includes my potatoes, carrots, beets, leafy greens, onions, and strawberries. Now for zone number 3, there aren't any raised beds involved at all. And this includes the back fence area as well as my raspberries. And then for zone 4, we've got my cut flower area that also is not a raised bed at all, as well as where I grow my cucumbers and our little greenhouse. And zone 5, completely different once again, because this is where we have Squash City. So now I'm gonna take you through each of the different growing zones so you can specifically see what different components am I utilizing depending on what plants I'm trying to grow. And so first up, we have zone 1. And in these first 2 beds, we've got tomatoes and basil. And then in the 3rd bed, we've got the garlic. And so the first really cool part about this setup is that for each one of the raised beds, I put a header into the bed so that I can connect whatever irrigation components I want to each bed individually. And so to do this, I first measured across the width of the bed and cut a piece of main line to that length. Then I added an end cap onto one side so water wouldn't spray out. And on the other side, I added an elbow so that I could bury it and integrate it directly into the bed. So once I had the elbow on, I then cut another piece of main line to the height of the bed, which is 17 inches. I put another elbow connector, and coming off of that, another 6 inches of main line so that I could run it out of the bed to where I'm going to ultimately connect it to the faucet. So I put a header just like this into each one of the beds, but they obviously were not yet connected to the faucet. So to do that, I actually started at the furthest away bed rather than at the faucet. And then I connected the main line to that elbow and ran it back to the next bed. Once I got to the next bed, I put a T connector in place and connected the 2 beds, and coming out the other side, I just continued to run main line. And I continued this process until I was all the way back at the faucet. Okay. Alrighty, so now I've got the main line coming out of the automatic timer, and then it's running along the path. This is all gonna get buried over the course of the next week, but I wanted to show you how it runs. And then it goes into the first bed right there, but then also using that T-splitter continues along to the next bed, T-splitter once again, and it continues along to the 3rd bed, knee pad from filming earlier, and then continues along to the last bed right here. So where that left me was with all the beds now connected to the faucets, water coming to the beds, but no actual components yet in the bed. And that was the next part of this project, was determining which components to be utilizing for each of the plants that I'm looking to grow. And now for background context, what I've used in the past are just these misters or bubblers or sprayers, and they're really great, but I've started moving away from them for 2 reasons. The big one is just that they're not incredibly efficient. So they're gonna spray water kind of every which direction. And what I wanna begin moving towards is watering right at the base of the plant in as efficient of a manner as possible. And secondly, plants are gonna require different amounts of water. So these tomato plants, they're gonna require a lot more water than the basil that I have right beside it. So what I've done instead is for the tomatoes, I ran main line right down the middle of the bed. And then at the base of each plant, I punched a hole into that line and then added a 2 gallon per hour drip emitter. And you're probably wondering, why did I not just go with one of the prefabricated drip lines or drip tapes? And my experience has just been that I haven't found one that gives off enough water for the larger plants, such as tomatoes, cucumbers, zucchinis, etc. A lot of those drip emitters give off kind of like 0.5 gallons per hour to maybe 0.8 gallons per hour. So now by utilizing these individual components, they're going to be receiving 2 gallons per hour. And just on that note, I am going to tag all the different products down in the description of the video that I utilize throughout my irrigation system, so you can use all of them or even just some of them, whatever makes your life a little bit easier. Which, speaking of that, I utilize something different for the basil. So for the basil, it doesn't require as much water as the tomatoes, so I simply ran a 1/4 inch drip line down the middle of the basil. And on that drip line is an emitter every 6 inches. And again, this gives off probably about like 0.4 to 0.5 gallons per hour, so significantly less than what the tomatoes are getting right next door. And one quick note on this drip line is that I played around with Rainbird, which is probably the most common drip line that people would utilize. I wasn't crazy about it, and I came across this brand called Agrifim, and I've absolutely loved it so far. I find it to be significantly more consistent than Rainbird, but the challenge is that I haven't been able to find it anywhere online. So I'm going to include the name to it down in the description of this video, but it's possible that you're going to have to just ask your local irrigation shop if they happen to have it on hand. So that's the setup for the tomatoes and the basil. I'm going to turn it on real quick so you can see how it looks. So literally all the water going right into the root zone. Now the last bed in zone 1 is the garlic, and they are garlic honkers right now, just about all set and ready to be harvested. And for this bed, to be honest, I haven't fully set up the irrigation just yet. Reason why is because once I harvest this garlic out, I'm going to be putting my last sprout box garden in, and at that point in time, I'll put the exact same header setup into the bed so I can then attach whichever components I would like to for that bed. So that wraps up zone number 1. Let's move on to zone number 2, which is also raised beds, but I'm doing a little bit of a different setup over there. So in zone 2, I've got my potatoes, followed by my carrots, beets, leafy greens, onions, and then the strawberry bed on the far side. Now getting started with the potatoes, very similar setup to what you saw in growing zone 1. I simply ran main line down the middle of the bed and then punched in a 2 gallon per hour drip emitter at the base of each plant so that all the water is going right down to the growing zone. So nothing new for us to be kind of thinking about in that zone. But as we move into the next 2 beds where I've got my carrots, beets, leafy greens, as well as my onions, we're planting much more densely. So with our potatoes and our tomatoes, there's about 1 plant per square foot. Now with my carrots, there's like 14 plants per square feet. So we need to make sure that that water is distributing more evenly throughout the bed. So for both of these beds, I'm using the same 1/4 inch drip line throughout it, but in this instance, I have one of them every 6 inches. And this brings me to another really important learning that I've gained through all the experimentation with irrigation that I've been doing. And that is when using 1/4 inch drip line, always keep them less than 8 feet in length. So these 2 beds here are only 6.5 feet. So all these 1/4 inch drip lines that you're seeing are only about 6.5 feet long. I've found by keeping them a little bit shorter, it ensures that each of the drip emitters give out a very consistent amount of water. So keep that one in mind if you do end up utilizing 1/4 inch drip line. Now at the very end, I have my strawberries, and this is a little bit of a different setup as well. Now, just before I explain how I've got the strawberries bed set up, I'm just gonna remove a little bit of this straw, and you've probably seen it in some of the other beds as well. It's something that I'm experimenting with at the moment for watering, amongst other reasons, and I've been a big fan of it so far. It's really helping to keep moisture in the bed and stop the sun from evaporating it. So for the strawberry bed, the first kind of obvious difference is that we're no longer in a rectangular shape, we're now into a circular environment. So the first thing I did for this bed was I ran a main line up to the top so I could once again be adding whatever components that I wanted to. And then from there, I attached 1/4 inch drip line, and rather than running it in a straight line, I simply coiled it around the bed, going all the way into the inside. So that's what we're seeing beneath the straw here throughout the bed. But I had a feeling I was gonna need a little bit more water in this bed. So I took another 1/4 inch feeder line and connected a sprayer or a bubbler to the other end of it. And then I zap strapped that onto a piece of bamboo and put it right into the middle of the bed. What that allowed me to do was basically have a sprayer that was misting over top of these strawberries as well. But what I quickly found out was that because I've been experimenting and utilizing straw, it's actually keeping tons of moisture in the bed. And by having this sprayer on as well, this bed was starting to get overwatered. But the beautiful part about these sprayers is that they've got an adjustable knob at the top. So all that I need to do is just turn it all the way to off. I can leave it in place, and now the bed is no longer getting overwatered. And honestly, as I dig through right now, I can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 strawberries that are all ripening. And to be honest, I've never actually had that many strawberries ripening all at once. So I think we're pointed in the right direction with this setup. So that wraps up zone 1 and zone 2. And just before we move along to zone 3 and 4, which are completely different than what we've gone through already with zone 1 and 2, you might be wondering, why don't I just have all of this set up as one zone? They're all raised beds. And this really comes back to what I mentioned at the beginning of the video about having the ability to use up to 8 different growing zones. And so the key piece of information to know on this front that I didn't know when I was starting irrigation is that a house faucet effectively can give off 200 gallons per hour. And so when I connect that first red emitter to it that gives out 2 gallons per hour, we've now utilized 2 of the 200 gallons per hour. And then as I started to add those 1/4 inch feeder lines that had emitters every 6 inches that are about 0.5 gallons per hour, it's also taking away from that total of 200. And so for myself in zone 1 there, it's about 140 to 150 gallons per hour of emitters that I'm utilizing. But if I were to add on all of zone 2, that would put us up to probably closer to 300 gallons per hour, which would be above the 200 gallons per hour that my faucet can handle. And as a result, all the beds would start to get watered really unevenly, and I wouldn't have as much control over top of it. And then on the other side of things, I've got other little kind of bits and bobs, such as my herb box, and that also needed to be added onto an irrigation line. So I was able to pop that onto zone 1, and because I was pretty far below that total limit of 200 gallons per hour, I'm able to now add it on without having any complications or throwing anything else off. So with that being said, let's continue along, and we're actually gonna skip over zone 3 because it's very similar to zone 4, and it's just gonna be a little bit easier for me to show you things in zone 4, and it's a much more dynamic environment. All right, and the thing that I really wanted to highlight in zone number 4 here is my cut flower bed. And specifically that it is a completely random shape. It's a bit of a triangle here. It's much larger than 4 feet in space, and that makes it a much different environment to be trying to water. So for this bed, I've decided to stay with those bubblers that I've been utilizing in the past years. And so to do this, I ran a main line from the faucet all the way right into the middle of this bed. And then coming off of the main line, I attached 1/4 inch feeder line with a bubbler or sprayer at the end of it. And what I love most about these bubblers is that they've got a little knob on the top where you can adjust the pressure to be either really low so it's barely a trickle, or really high so that it's covering a much larger area. So once I put the sprayers in, I then actually turn the water on and go through the bed, adjusting each of the knobs so that the entire bed is watered. And one of the things that made this whole process much more enjoyable was utilizing my muck boots, which is the sponsor of today's video. Setting up the irrigation inevitably results in water spraying all over the place, and all of their boots are 100% waterproof. So I was able to go through each of the beds, setting things up. I even had the irrigation explode on me one time during the setup.
Oh boy.
And had it gushing directly on the boots, and my feet were completely dry all throughout.
Forgot to close that, but staying dry.
And on top of that, they're the most comfortable boots that I've tried on. My personal favorite have become the Chelsea Outscapes, and if you want to try them out, you can do so down at the link in the description of this video and utilize the code MINDANDSOIL10 for a 10% discount. So now I've got really nice coverage all throughout this more dynamic environment, and needless to say, the dahlias are loving it. The fact that they're already blooming as much as they are at the end of June, I've never had blooms like this early on. So I'm really happy with how it's all going. Now we're gonna head down to Squash City for zone number 5, our final zone for today. And then at the very end of the video, I'm gonna share with you what frequency I'm watering at and how long I'm watering for during each of those watering times. Let's head to Squash City. So in each of these little pockets here on my front slope is where I plant my squash. And to provide some context for you on that front, this front slope is hands down my sunniest growing area. And squash, zucchinis, cucumbers, watermelons, anything in the cucurbit family, they absolutely love sun, and they also need tons of moisture. So right now, they're still quite small plants. But check this out, over the course of the next 60 days, if properly watered, they're going to get absolutely massive. And that's what we need to set them up for. But the challenge with this area is that first, it's obviously on a slope, which is way different than a raised bed or growing in ground on a flat area. And the second piece is that it's obviously way more landscape than some of the areas in my backyard that are purely focused on production. So here's how I set up the irrigation so they have all the water they need to thrive. From the faucet, I once again ran a main line all the way out to this front slope here where I then capped it. Then coming off of that main line, I started to connect 1/4-inch feeder lines, and I ran those down the slope to each of the little pockets where I plant my squashes and zucchinis, etc. Then at the end of the feeder line, I simply connected another bubbler or sprayer as the watering emitter. And now I could have used the 2-gallon-per-hour drip emitters. However, I've really enjoyed utilizing those bubblers or sprayers because once again, I can adjust that knob up or down. So I can turn it off completely if I don't have anything growing in there, or I can turn it up a little bit higher, especially as these squash grow and they need even more water. So I simply repeated that process for all of the squash that I've planted into Squash City to ensure that each plant in this area has its own unique emitter. This is actually the one part of the irrigation setup that I've kept in place from last year, and that's just because it performed so well for me last year. The number of zucchinis, squashes, cucumbers I had coming off of the plants last year was way more than I could handle on my own. The last thing that I want to touch on just before we wrap up is how frequently am I watering and for how long during each of those watering times. And so the entire setup, every single zone, is set up to run every other day. So I'm watering every 2 days. And then each of those times that it turns on, each zone is set up to run for 25 minutes. So every other day, 25 minutes. Now, if we ever get a rainy stretch, I just turn the whole system off with a click of a button. And if we ever have a heat wave coming through, I'll sometimes increase that frequency to watering still for 25 minutes, but every single day. But there you have it. That's the rundown on my brand new irrigation setup. I'm really loving it. I think it's really sleek, really sexy, really efficient. And as mentioned, all the components, products that I've utilized are tagged down in the description of this video. I'd love to hear your thoughts, what you think. Let me know down in the comments. And other than that, catch you on the next video. See you then.